Okay, so we're now recording. Welcome everybody to the first SIG cloud provider meeting. We have a lot of work ahead of us. I want to say thanks to Andrew for putting in a lot of the work to get this SIG up and running. And thanks everybody for coming. I think that we're going to be doing some important work here. And Andrew just dropped the document with the agenda into the chat. So if you haven't had a chance to go put your name into the list of attendees, please head over there. And it actually might be helpful if, in addition to your name, if you also put what cloud provider you're representing, so that you know when we can start putting names to faces, and you know, for the work that we're doing here. And actually, since this is our first meeting, why don't we start off maybe with a few introductions from everybody, so that we can get acquainted. I'm Chris Hodge with the OpenStack Foundation. I work I'm one of the leads on SIG OpenStack, and yeah, and I'm also one of the leads for this new SIG. And I'll turn it over to everyone else to quickly introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I work at DigitalOcean, and I'm also one of the leads for this new SIG.
And I'm Jago McLeod. I'm at Google. I'm the third lead in that trio.
Hi, I'm Richard Tice, and I'm working for IBM on the IBM cloud provider for our container service.
I'm Steve Wong, chair of the VMware SIG and working on the vSphere cloud provider.
And Fabio Raposelli, also working for VMware, also working on a vSphere cloud provider, co-chair of the SIG VMware, and technical lead for this new cloud provider vSphere thing.
Hi, I'm Hannes. I work for Pivotal, and we might help out with the VMware cloud provider stuff.
Hey, I'm Cole. I don't actually work for Microsoft, but I'm the tech lead for SIG Azure, so I'm attending.
I'm David Lyle. I'm one of the co-leads for SIG OpenStack, and I work for Intel.
Hi, I'm Oxen from Alibaba Cloud China. Thanks.
See, Zach is here too, representing SIG Docs. One of our collaborations. All right, so I guess let's dive into the rest of the agenda. So the first thing that we have on the agenda is the KEP for reporting end-to-end tests to test grid. Do you want to take that away, Andrew?
Yes. I think someone's mic is also giving a lot of feedback. So if you're not talking, it'd be good if you can just mute yourself. Yeah, so last week I wrote a KEP to kind of put together all the work we've been doing with end-to-end tests. So Ben the Elder, that's probably not his real name. So Ben from Google, he kind of helped us get set up with end-to-end tests, how to run end-to-end tests, and how to actually upload it to a central place where we can kind of start reporting those tests mostly for SIG release, to actually use it as a way to signal if a release is going well, if there's any critical bugs and whatnot. So the KEP really outlines at the most basic level what we're trying to do with end-to-end tests, and it also has like actual concrete instructions for how to actually do that. And so some of the steps are a bit manual, and we also assume that you have your own cluster running, and that like it doesn't really care about how you provision your cluster. It's just purely steps on like how to actually test a working cluster, and then how to upload those tests to test grid. So test grid is kind of like, it's a centralized kind of testing infrastructure, test result collector that's right now managed by Google. But we'll be kind of storing test results from every cloud provider there, so that we can kind of just have like a central place to store results. So next steps for that KEP is, if you are a current cloud provider or you're going to be a new cloud provider into the Kubernetes ecosystem, if you could please review that PR, outline any issues you see with it, or just give it a thumbs up if you think it's good, so then we can kind of move forward there and then start seeing some more cloud providers adding tests. Any questions with that? Cool. Please take a look at the PR.
Okay, so moving on to the next item on the agenda is the doc updates. So one of the outstanding goals of this new SIG is to have all of the cloud providers create consistent docs that meet a basic level of standards, so that the SIG docs team will be able to either point to consistent and stable locations where we can ensure the quality of those documents, or to perhaps republish some of those documents. So we've been talking with, I've been going to this SIG docs meeting, and we've been talking about this. Right now, since we're at the end of the release cycle for 1.11, we should really be looking at what we can do to publish the docs for, to kind of build these standards and publish the docs for 1.12. And so I think that we should be targeting, as the final deadline for all of the cloud provider documentation to be completed at the regular docs deadline, which will be established once the 1.12 timeline is set up. In the meantime, we have a KEP in place that talks a little bit about the documentation requirements. Some things we published there that I think that we can actually build a more devoted documentation KEP from. I will put a link to that in the chat here, and also in the meeting notes. Yeah, sorry, I jumped ahead on the AWS doc update too. But the next big step is going to be writing a KEP for the documentation requirements.
Yeah, and that KEP is we're probably going to need every cloud provider there to also approve of that KEP, so that we have like a one standard that everyone's following, so that we don't have like a mismatch of different different docs in different parts of the doc site.
Yeah, and that's exactly the idea. And the way I envisioned this was that there would be a minimum of 2 documents. The first would be a getting started document, which would essentially tell you how to just an introduction on how to use the cloud provider code for your particular cloud. But then also a settings and configuration document that would be kept up to date with all of the current settings that are available, so that you have a complete reference, and the users of the provider code don't have to go start digging around in code to figure out exactly how they can configure. I think with those 2 minimum things in a consistent format, we should cover probably 80% of the interest out there. The other thing that we might want to require is if we want any documentation on how people want to become involved with the development efforts, we might want to consider adding that also.
Hey, so Andrew and Chris, Nishi from AWS. So I've actually been working on this, at least from the AWS side. So we found 2 specific, to your initial point, we found 2 specific areas of improvement. One is what needs to happen if kubeadm, for example, is used to set up cloud provider, and what are the files that need to automatically be changed in the API server, the controller manager, and the kubelet when kubeadm is initiated for customers who use cloud provider directly on a Kubernetes cluster that they create from scratch. And the other is, in any case, people should know what are the config changes that happen if they want to automate this process in any managed service. So we actually documented missing annotations from the current load balancing documentation that's up for cloud provider Kubernetes specific to AWS. I was going to raise an issue today because Andrew shared a PR, I guess, which talks about updating documentation, but I want to raise an issue specific to AWS and start working on that. I think you made a comment of how people can contribute to cloud provider. That is a category that's not covered in that issue, but I'm happy to sort of work on that based on the KEP proposal we propose.
And Nishi, do you have any links to the issues and documents that you're working from?
Yes, I am happy to share it. As soon as I raise the issue, I'll link up all the Google Docs and share it with you guys.
That's fantastic. Thank you.
So I guess let me try to paraphrase what I just heard, but initially you proposed that there has to be a minimum standard of a getting started doc and a how to get involved. And then somebody has gone in and suggested that, gee, it'd be nice to add kubeadm on top of that, and then maybe kube spray as well. But I'm wondering if we shouldn't have sort of a table of, you know, the minimum standard, the kind of nice to have, and then the gold-plated version for cloud providers to, you know, tackle the documentation issue. Just having a checklist, I think, will help achieve consistency.
I agree. And all I'm acknowledging is I have not done the work to define what the checklist should be if someone wants to contribute to cloud provider AWS. I have a decent structure on what's missing from the current documentation relevant to cloud provider AWS.
Yeah, because I think this is valuable because it actually is. I've found, even though I've been working on the Kubernetes project for years now, that this documentation has sort of sprayed all over the place when it comes to cloud providers, and it isn't very consistent. We're probably not going to miraculously make it consistent in the next 3 months, but just to inventory where all of these sort of things potentially would be valuable.
What's the scope? What's the scope of what we're documenting? Are we documenting just the cloud provider configuration and options? Because in my experience, that's been fairly bring up agnostic, and I think we're going to get into a real rat's nest if we try to document every single deployment tool plus every cloud provider configuration option.
Yeah, I think some of these deployment role tools are perhaps not super appropriate for some of the providers too. So it's sort of a grid where I have a feeling that some providers might make a declaration that, look, we don't really recommend this tool. It doesn't make sense for our cloud, but these other ones do. But having a central place where you at least know what all the options are would be good.
Right. Okay, I got you. Makes sense.
Right, and the whole idea is that the people who are working on the cloud provider code, we would, you know, the expectation would be that as a member of SIG cloud provider, you know, if you were working on, you know, if you were the AWS authors or the Azure authors or the OpenStack authors, that those teams would be responsible for producing and maintaining that documentation. So we wouldn't want to make, you know, the individual members of the SIG have to go through and document all these things, but actually make the people who are the experts and who are essentially in charge of that code, and you know, and have that be culturally part of their development process.
Agreed.
Yeah, and so to add on top of that, for some context, the reason why we're talking about kind of basic configuring cloud provider docs and then kubeadm is because the kubeadm folks or the developers who are kind of developing kubeadm have kind of raised up the issue a couple times that they want to link out to cloud provider docs for their kubeadm docs, but because those docs are lacking, they want They want to kind of raise some red flags to us so that we work on it. So I think they are two separate issues, which again, and when we develop the KEP, we'll kind of have a concrete checklist to go through.
Hey guys, quick ask. Who owns the KEP, and can SIG AWS take onus on the KEP, given we always hear that we don't do enough? This is an opportunity for us to probably do some work with you guys. So if you are open to looking for people who can collaborate on the KEP, happy to jump in.
Yes, I've been working on that, and yes, I would be happy for you to take the lead on that.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah, the idea is that anyone can propose a KEP belonging to like a SIG. So like at any time, if you want to propose an idea, you can just open a PR for a KEP.
Cool.
Yeah. And I don't know, Zach, did you have anything that you wanted to add to any of this conversation?
I think first and foremost that I'm really glad to be having this conversation. I had a practical question. So when I think about creating a checklist for document, well, let me back up. Where's the best place to offer specific feedback about what a standard, what standards for content look like? Would that be the KEP that you linked?
Maybe. I don't know. I don't know if it necessarily. I mean, so the KEP that I linked into there was kind of some documentation on the larger cloud provider code in general, and and building out the cloud controller manager, and then being able to plug things into that. I think it might make sense to, as we work on these individual issues going forward, to devote a single KEP to them, so that we can keep the KEP focused and make it so that we have reachable and deliverable goals, and also to simplify linking. Like the link I sent is actually buried pretty deep inside of that KEP, and so. And it was an update to another one. So I think that for cleanness and clarity and managing work, I would propose that we start a new KEP on this.
Awesome. Yes, because I have some specific ideas for what good standards could look like for documentation, specifically about adding reviewers and a title block for a file, but we can get into specifics when it's time for that. I will say that I'm really happy to be having this discussion, because I think that the getting started documentation is one of the weakest spots in Kubernetes documentation right now. It's not even called getting started, it's called setup. And what we're doing right now with the documentation that we have is that we're dual sourcing documentation poorly. We're hosting basically outdated secondary versions of cloud provider documentation. And I would really, I'm looking forward to having cloud providers have more direct ownership over the content of their files. My preference for documentation is to link out as much as possible to providers' own documentation. Because I don't think that it makes sense for us to I don't think that it makes sense for the Kubernetes website to host a poor dual reflection of providers' own documentation.
Well, exactly.
That said,
if cloud providers are going out of tree themselves, it seems inevitable that the documentation is associated with this thing out of tree. So you wouldn't want to have the documentation in the tree while the code itself is not.
Yeah, I think there might be space for, there are going to be shared steps for setting these things up, shared interfaces, and so perhaps part of this process too should be identifying what are the shared things, so that we don't because another concern that I would have is that every cloud provider would write their own documentation and they would all be describing the same thing in different ways, and to me that feels inefficient.
There's also a problem of providing like consistent, experience to the user trying to set it up one of those cloud providers, because right now people go to the website, they see a nice web page, they follow the tutorial or the how-to, whatever it is, but then they have to dig into like a markdown document stored on GitHub to finish up, the cloud provider setup. So, and if we move in the documentation to, every cloud provider repo, we have to figure out a way to make sure that the consistent experience the people are getting is at least similar.
Yes. I'd also like to, having a consistent high standard for shared tasks among cloud providers also reduces the burden on localization teams. Right now we have 3 localization projects in flight: Chinese, Korean, Japanese, and asking localization teams to translate the same set of instructions n number of times seems like an unreasonable burden on localization teams. So it's that kind of streamlining, I think, represents an improvement for everyone in the contribution pipeline, from authors to maintainers to users.
I'm just brainstorming here, but I'm wondering if we shouldn't come up with a recommendation or demand that these different versions of the documentation get tagged with the cloud provider's name found frequently in them, just to allow filtering of search results. Putting myself in the shoes of an end user, I don't want to have to search for the docs on a volume mount in Google search and then have 100 different versions for different cloud providers that I have to sort through when I'm really only interested in one.
Right. So one of the requirements that we have in the KEP that I listed before is standardization of where documentation lives. And so for things that are common, there would be there. So right now we've for the entry providers who are currently working on moving that code out. We have Kubernetes org repositories that all have similar names, like cloud provider, OpenStack, or cloud provider, AWS, or so on. And as we as we add more of these repositories, there's going to be an expectation that when you add documentation, the documentation will be in similar places, so that if a user is looking for one particular type of documentation, it should be as easy as just changing the name of the cloud provider in the repository, and it should pull up the same documentation for that specific provider.
I like that. So it's along the lines, if you will, of coming up with a consistent list of headings in a table of contents.
Yeah.
And going
there
back
would be
to
uniformity there on subject coverage.
Just wanted to go back to Zach's question about where to give feedback. I think on the guidelines, I agree it should be a separate KEP, but there are likely high-level ideas around naming convention and structure that should go into this KEP, and making those changes and suggestions now will be super helpful to guiding this in the direction that is most understandable and fits best into the context of the larger documentation efforts in Kubernetes as a whole. So that would be super helpful if you could take a look at this KEP and look at, it is called Getting Started here, but there may be other things that are clearly things we want to do now. That would be really helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so I think that covers the docs update. Was there anything else? Were there any other updates you wanted to add, Nishi?
No, at this point I'm good. Thank you.
And there are finally, to close out this topic, we have 2 outstanding issues. One is
yeah, I just put those there as a reference.
Yeah, for reference, but talking about some of the current limitations that we have with the documentation right now. So if you have a chance, take a look at those, and that gives a little bit of context to where this discussion is coming from. Okay, so moving on to the next topic, we have moving Walter's building CCM proposal to KEP. So I will let Walter take that over.
Yeah, so this is an attempt to take a document that I think I shared earlier and make it a formal part of the CAP. Just kind of going over at a high level. We have an idea of what we want to do, but not a huge amount of detail in how we actually do things like make a build, make a deployment, how the in-tree cloud providers actually successfully move out, and how we deal with things like some of the controllers which need to be built both into the KCM and the CCM. So this is my attempt to detail all of those problems that need to be solved and suggest a way that we can do that. That is, it starts out being kind of in-tree cloud provider specific, but the end result, I think, needs to be something that even the out-of-tree providers are going to want to deal with. So it deals with things like having a Kubernetes build tag, which just builds you a kernel that you can then package into your cloud provider specific build. How you'd go about that. Where should certain things live? Like, maybe we would like to keep the cloud provider implementations as SIG cloud provider repos, and then have a separate thing, which is the cloud provider implementer repo for a lot of the building, packaging, and deployment. And so I really encourage everyone to go through with this. If we're going to make progress, the repo is now open, and I would really like to see us start making some of these changes very soon. So you can expect me to start sending some PRs out for that. So please take a look at this CAP. Every cloud provider should probably make sure that I haven't done something that's going to impede you from succeeding. So please make sure you take a look at that. And yeah, if anyone has any questions, and if Andrew's about to tell me, hey, I suggested you break it out into a separate CAP. Yes, you did. I did see that. I just haven't had a chance to do it, but I'll keep the pull number the same so that, that tag or that link continues to work.
Read my mind.
Cool. Any questions? Anyone concerns? Anything anyone wants to know about that? Nick?
Can you share the CAP again? Link to the CAP?
I believe it's actually in the agenda. But
Thank you.
and in fact, I think Andrew just put it in the chat as well.
Andrew's got the fastest copy paste.
Yes, he does. Anyone else? So Nick, have you had a chance to look at it? You there?
Yeah, I looked at it a while back, but I haven't looked at the most recent revision that you moved into the CAP.
Yeah, so if you like Nick and whoever else can take a look at that, that'd be really appreciated.
Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I just pointed Dims at it too. So
awesome.
I'll get some
Thank you. Cool. Well, that's what I had.
Cool. Okay, so I think mine's next. Earlier this week, I created another CAP, which is not really a CAP, it's just a CAP template. And so the idea there is when new providers want to kind of fold under SIG Cloud Provider as a sub-project, essentially the process right now is that they would create a CAP proposing that new sub-project, and then as long as it kind of, as long as they meet those prereqs that we have in place, then we can kind of have them fold under us as a sub-project. So the prereqs right now is that they have a repository that has a working implementation of the Cloud Controller Manager. And then arbitrarily we have that they have a reasonable amount of user experience report. And so like what that means, we kind of kept it vague just because we actually don't know exactly how we want to determine this going forward. But as we kind of get more experience with this, we can have more concrete requirements there. Yeah, so that's about it. I also want to add end-to-end tests as a requirement once we have the infrastructure and the documentation and everything in place. But as of right now, it's not there just because we don't have everything figured out.
Yeah, there are some issues with how you report test results back in the GCP buckets, and if the GCP is going to be required to store your test results, or if we're going to be able to start pulling data from other buckets.
And that kind of leads on to the next topic of this is not just something we want for new providers. We also want all the current entry providers to eventually create that cap, just so we have that central place of all the providers and what they need out of SIG cloud provider going forward.
So are there any questions on this template? So if everyone can take a look at that and see if that's comment on the pull request, really the cloud providers that are looking at bringing their code into the Kubernetes org, that would be really helpful. So the last topic is more of a higher level topic, and it actually kind of comes back to it actually ties in with Walter's CCM proposal, Kep. Ultimately, one of the goals that we're trying to accomplish here is to remove code from Kubernetes, and that's pretty important, and it's going to take a while. And so one of the things that should be on our agenda, and we don't have to solve it today, but is coming up with a timeline of what's the target for how we want code to start being removed, and what policies do we want to have in place so that to encourage development to stop on the in-tree cloud providers and to focus primarily on the out-of-tree providers, and what can we do to support that transitions? What can we do to support that transition? I think that there are some very real-world issues that people will face. Like, I know that there are a lot of installers and other automated tooling that assume the in-tree provider, and so it's not just a matter of writing the code and having the code be there and available and documented for people to use, but also heading out into our respective communities who depend upon our work and encouraging them to make that transition so that we can remove that dependency and ultimately kind of pull all of this code out and reduce the maintenance overhead within the Kubernetes repository. I don't know if anyone has any ideas about what a reasonable timeline on that work looks like. I'm always in favor of moving faster, but I may move too fast.
So I have two comments on that. I just recently talked with the storage team, and my general feeling is we're probably, I would love to work out how to do it faster, but even we have dependencies on other teams, and the storage team seem to think we're probably looking at about a year before they felt like they would be in a good place for this. So getting the CSI sidecar working, getting all of the wrappers around the CSI for all the old PDs, putting the switches in, migrating all the customers, and then forcing everyone to default to the CSI sidecar, and then removing the old code, they seem to think was probably about a year. And we may want to sit down and talk with them on, is that really how quickly they can get it done, or are things we can do to make that work a little better? Related to this, and I don't want to be a buzzkill, but one of the things I noticed in the last week is that there are things working against us that we need to be aware of and maybe work out. So as an example, in the last month, someone added a new cloud provider method. Node has been deleted from cloud provider, and which in and of itself I don't necessarily have a problem with, but that then has become a call that is made from code that we are not planning on moving out of Kubernetes. So the total workload for migration has gone up, for something that hasn't even been implemented yet. So I think there's a certain amount of diligence that we need to start looking at exercising, keeping our eyes open, and trying to head off things like new cloud provider calls being added into modules that we did not intend to move.
So let me make a comment. I think it may be true that we're going to have to envision even a transition period where the in-tree ones still are in tree but are subject to being disabled, so that you could switch. You would have this period of 6 months a year where you could opt into the new out-of-tree version or not, as you choose. And maybe we start the entry of this transition period where the default is that you're using the in-tree version, and then towards the end we flop it the other way and ultimately remove the code. The reason is that, I mean, if I were in the shoes of an end user, I'm going to be skeptical of this new version and maybe not want to go on it the very release comes out. And it would solve some of these issues of giving us a little runway to port some of these install tools so that they just have a somewhat satisfactory user experience where we don't have to have this big bang of simultaneously updating not just what we did with these cloud providers, but all the other peripheral things that go along with it.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we're trying to do in OpenStack to be the carrot to get people to try to move away is we're not really accepting new features upstream. We'll try to do bug fixes, and we'll try to make sure that the code continues to work, and we keep the two forks synced up. But new things are going, new features like we have a feature that will synchronize Keystone authentication with RBAC authentication, and that's not going upstream. So part of the hope is that the features that are going into the out-of-tree provider will be an incentive for people to get off of the in-tree provider.
Yeah, I think we will have to live in that dual world as well. Accelerating that migration is, of course, beneficial to the people maintaining those things. So for us, we want that to happen as quickly as possible when we start it.
Well, and the reason I bring mine up is that, I agree, I refer to it as the phased approach. But to get into that first phase where it's really working, we've got to be able to get out all of the cloud provider calls out of code that we don't want it, that we're not planning on moving. And, it's much easier to prevent it from going in than it is to rewrite the code once someone's already implemented it somewhere. It's like, let's get them to implement it the right way for us rather than having to try and, move their code and find a new owner and get them all to agree on the new workflow. And it's much better if we can start heading some of this stuff off.
I wonder if there's a way we can automate the inspection for the cloud provider references so we can compare it from one release to another, so we're at least aware of those. Because I expect communicating broadly has the challenge that people ignore broad communications at this point in this project. But figuring that out would be a good starting point. On the incentive aspect, I expect the incentive of being able to iterate externally from the Kubernetes repository as the carrot, and the having to maintain dual implementations as the stick are going to be sufficient, and we don't need to come up with any formal end time at which code will be deleted. But if that turns out not to be true, we can revisit that one. But I think between the pain and the velocity improvements, it will be. Chris, maybe you can, is that true? Is that my hunch right on that?
Yeah, I mean, we have significantly increased our participation within the OpenStack code over the last 3 months because working on the external provider. It's just that people have a much easier time showing up, getting the pull requests in, and it's they're not rebasing all the time. They're not. I mean, there's so many things that work for us that I think in the end, it's been working. I think deadlines are good too. I think that having a goal is always nice and motivates people.
I know, but just don't get depressed by that year thing that Walter said before.
Yeah.
Don't let that disincentivize you from keeping effort on it. If we don't start now, we won't get rid of that in a year either. So
Yeah.
Keep it moving.
I think a year's fast. So.
Oh God, my attention span is not that long.
So, okay. Are there any other comments or questions on any of this? Then I think it's worthwhile if anybody has any other issues or agenda items they'd like to bring up. I guess we have an open floor now. No? So these meetings are, if I'm correct, these meetings are going to be bi-weekly. So we'll meet at this time every other month. And we are going to have a quarterly review of the meeting time. So if we start adding more participants from the Asia Pacific region or from Europe, rebalancing the meetings to make sure that we accommodate our worldwide culture, we'll be doing on a quarterly basis. And I want to thank everybody for coming to the meeting.
Okay, just now that you mentioned bi-weekly and the worldwide interest, those of us in the United States happen to have the next one fall right on a holiday. But
oh, good point. Yes, that's on the 4th of July. So I guess I don't know, Andrew, and
we'll figure it out.
Yeah, we'll figure it out.
Good point. Thanks.
Good catch.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, gang. Bye.
Bye.